It's a good reminder to myself. We invite you to keep your video on, but remain muted unless Bruce or Elly ask you for some feedback. We've allocated an hour to the session. If you've not submitted a question as yet, please do so using the chat box on the window. And if you wish to remain anonymous, you can send the question directly to myself and I will go on. I would now like to pass you over to Elly to start the Q&A session. Thank you, Elly.
Thank you, Claire. It's really good to be here tonight, and thank you for everybody who's joined us. I'm going to dive straight in because I'm conscious we've got an hour and everybody's got an evening. So if that's okay with Bruce, I will just begin. Great. So the last time I actually saw you, Bruce, I can remember it was 2019, and it was the Restraint Reduction Network conference, and we were there discussing children's human rights, which I know we have a shared passion around. But it was obviously pre what's happened in the last 2 years, and in that last 2-year period, we've seen relationships affected in so many different ways. And that's for children, young people and their families, but also across the entire world. It's hit all of us. So just with that as sort of context, which I think everybody has walked through and constantly thinks about on their daily experience, it brings us really to the point of how important relationships are now in our recovery state. But one of the first things I really wanted to ask was, in terms of relationships, what would you say was the most significant one that impacted your life in terms of where you are now and what you want to do?
Thanks, Elly. That's a great question, and I think it's really important that you did set that context about that. The last time that we saw each other, the world looked very different. We were face to face, for one, as opposed to looking through a camera, like most of us have been doing for the last couple of years, and that has really changed the way that I think we need to think about relationships, and we can learn a lot from that. But reflecting back in terms of my own significant relationships, I grew up in New Zealand. I grew up in a very rural area. With a big family of very stoic farmers, and there was a lot of non-verbal communication. I felt very, very loved, but we didn't talk about it a lot. But and they're all amazing people. But I'll give a couple of quick kind of reflections on. One is my relationship with my mother, who's one of my big human rights heroes. She was a nurse, and one of the things that happened in New Zealand, they changed the way in which nursing qualifications worked, and what that meant was that a lot of the older nurses, particularly in rural areas, who couldn't go and retrain and qualify at university, were kind of being pushed out of the profession. And my mum, and it was a real human rights defender. She saw the injustice of this, and she actually developed a program where she would go into rural areas, and particularly in Māori communities, and provide kind of training that meant that the nurses, predominantly women, predominantly older, could stay with their families and still get the university education without breaking up those relationships. And I traveled quite a lot with her in my teenage years, and just watching the impact of her work going into communities and the relationships of trust that she built up, and the fact that she was able to help them maintain their relationships within their communities was something really important. And that really inspired me in terms of thinking about how we connect with people in a way that maintains their own relationships and their own sense of who they are, while empowering them and giving them additional skills. And I think that's a really important example. And another quick thing that I think is really important to me is growing up throughout my life. One of my brothers has quite a complex medical condition, which has meant that he's lived his life in chronic pain, but also that his body has developed in a very different way in terms of restricting his mobility significantly. And seeing the bullying and the stigma and the assumptions that were made about him, and the courage and humor with which he confronted that, but also the relationship between him and my mother, and that really important human rights defender work that so many parents do in making sure that we challenge some of the ways in which we stigmatize and disconnect from people. And I think that again, I know it's something that you champion so well, Elly, and Ella's powerful work in terms of making sure that it's her voice, and in my case, my brother's voice. My mum was really good at making sure that it was my brother's voice that was prominent in those discussions when teachers were discouraging him or discounting him, that she didn't step in and take away his agency, that actually it was a really relationship-based focus that they had in fighting for his human rights. And so being a human rights defender while recognizing the really important kind of agency and voice of people whose rights that you're fighting for is absolutely at the heart of what we do. And I think, again, what you do so incredibly in reminding people of the importance of those relationships.
That's quite a background, isn't it? that's because it is very human as well. And I think obviously being a commissioner, people won't know all those things, and that you're just sharing that. Actually, I always say it's really important because everybody has a backstory, don't they? And part of relational understanding is that we all come from a space that we probably know nothing about, but it's impacted by the same human things that really matter, like relationships. And do you think in terms of society, and I'm just thinking, people often, I've heard people say, you know, that's kind of like a fluffy way to look at things, or that's you know, you shouldn't really have that kind of view when you're talking about professionals and families or young people and their support workers. And I'm thinking particularly around people who have different needs. I don't see humans as vastly different. Yes, we're all very different, but we have, you know, the equal needs and rights. But sometimes you hear people say, you know, you've got to maintain your distance, you've got to have your boundaries, you've got to have your profession, but really isn't being relational what you're saying, which is what your mum was doing, was creating a really powerful network of human connections that we call relationships, but they're very powerful connections, aren't they, wherever you have them, whether it's in work, whether it's when you're working with people, or whether it's with family. Would you say that it's a fluffy, not a fluffy, maybe that's not the right word, but you know, some people aren't comfortable with this language and they don't think they want, I don't think they want to go there, or they want to maintain a very sort of cut and dried view of how we interact with services and service, and that language of service user, and you know, those words I really cringe at, but it's still heavily used in services. So linking that, also thinking about policies and structures in society, like, are we looking at, we've got a long way to go still? Do you think we've come a long way in the pandemic? Do you think we've got you know, good innings in the future with this because of our recent experience?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of really powerful ideas in there. I think that we have to learn from the pandemic. I don't think the pandemic has been a good thing at all. But if anything good comes out of it, it has to be that learning. I really would challenge this idea that kind of relationship-based approach or is in any way kind of fluffy or kind of unprofessional, or because I mean, I'm a lawyer by trade. I'm an international human rights lawyer, which can often be seen as a very kind of strict kind of discipline. I've worked in conflict areas and in some of the kind of most difficult places that you can think of. And it's always about relationships. And not only is it about relationships in practice, but actually when you look at the international legal framework, there's a big poster just up in front of me on the wall, which is it's the Charter of the United Nations. And so when we started to create the whole idea of what society would look like following the horrors of the beginning of the 20th century and the Holocaust and two massive world wars, the starting point was we the peoples, and talks about, the UN Charter talks about we the peoples and about the connections that we need to make in order for society to work and the common commitment. It uses really strong relationship-based language in the UN Charter, which is the fundamental thing that sets out our international legal framework. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights speaks consistently about relationships throughout it, in terms of relationships between those in power and those that aren't, and relationships between us. And the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which sits right at the heart of what I do, starts with this idea that all children should grow up in a family relationship of happiness, love, and understanding, and that every government's job is to help create that. And family takes the broadest possible definition, of course, within that. But the idea that we're talking about happiness and love and understanding and family relationships and putting obligations on government to facilitate that is because we know that it's absolutely essential to make the legal framework and the human rights framework work. This isn't fluffy stuff at all. This is black letter law. This is written into the legal documents which govern the way in which the international community works. And you look around the world, and in every constitution, every society that we build, the way in which we build our laws, policies, and practice, they all start from concepts of relationship. Where it gets a bit lost, I think, is then suddenly when we start to put in place some of the policies and practices, and for some reason we feel the need to strip some of that out. And I don't really understand why, because the starting point is about relationships. It's about creating the environments that allow relationships to thrive, because we know that's the best way to deliver on the commitments that we've made in terms of human rights. And so I really do think this is a kind of a policy and practice issue. It's not really a law one. It's about making sure that our structures and policies and practices actually reflect on what our original commitment was, which was to create these environments that allow relationships to thrive as the best way of ensuring that we deliver on our commitments to create a society where people can thrive.
Yeah, I agree with you. I totally agree with you. I'm just thinking about somebody in my head as well. And I don't know if she's here tonight, Jennifer Knudsen, who works in Scotland. You'll probably know of Jen. Yeah. She's brilliant. And there's a lady called Rachel in England who's very similar, and they have relationship policies instead of behavior policies, and like thinking about the policies and the rights of children and rights of families and like whole family approaches. Because when we're talking about delivering services or policies or structures in society, it's not just the person who's in receipt of the support, is it? It's their whole family. It's the ripple effect. It's how that transcends across generations, supporting or it being in relationships, familiar relationships with that person. How do you think we could create more of a society that values relational needs first? I know it's in the law. I know it's in black and white, and it's great to hear you reiterate that, because you'll probably know, but England's going through a revision of sorts of their human rights. I don't want to get into that because it terrifies me, to be quite honest. But you know, this is something that, how do we create the understanding, or how do we encourage society to sort of value those relational needs and not shy from it? Because I often wonder if it's fear. I often wonder if it's like, I don't want to get too close because if I can't deliver, I've let them down. If I don't know how to deliver it, I don't have the resources, I don't have the backing of my senior management, I'm not in a space that's got the structure, it's just me. So how do we, for people in a position where they really want to do something that's relational, they see the value, they see the power in it, and they know it's going to work and it's going to have a really good outcome, but society's maybe got them in a space where it's not quite yet the thing you do, or it's getting there, but they're going to be a pioneer for that? How would you encourage that?
That's a great question, and I think that there are some real challenges here. Again, we're seeing what's happening in England with some retrogressive steps, and that's even just in relation to a fairly limited rights framework. But the reason I'll start with that, though, that the direction of travel in Scotland with the incorporation, so this new law that was passed last year, but we still need to improve upon a little bit, says the Supreme Court, to bring the Convention on the Rights of the Child into our domestic law, what that will change is that allows us to use those tools to deliver the cultural change that you're talking about. Because what it would require every public authority and every service to do would be to demonstrate, how are you ensuring that children's voices are properly heard in relation to this decision making? How are you ensuring that this decision is made in the best interest of the child, which would include getting their views, getting their family's views, the key relationships in that? How are you demonstrating that you're using available resources to the maximum extent possible in order to deliver this? And what it allows us to do is really challenge those that are in power making decisions to change the systems to ensure the demonstration that relationship-based focus that the convention speaks about, the support that needs to go to families, the time, the education around relationships. I think this is really important as well. The Convention on the Rights of the Child talks about the purpose of education, and one of the things that it lists is understanding relationships. That really kind of teaching emotional intelligence and relationship approaches is part of the right to education. So it's something that we need to bring through. And in fact, you often see it very, very well demonstrated in early years, and then as we get older, it starts to change. What I think your question touches upon though, which is a real concern, is that often the risk is pushed down to rather than held where it should be. And so my job is mainly holding Scottish Government to account and saying you need to put in place the proper laws and policies to ensure that this can thrive. But we need to shift the risk upwards, so that you're not having to feel brave or afraid. So we need to make sure that you've got the structures in place and the obligations on those that have the power to create the structures and the spaces and the training and the support to ensure that those relationships can actually thrive and be a bit messy and be a bit, my lights have just turned out, but hopefully it hasn't affected my camera. I'm sitting in the dark at the moment, but I think I'm still.
Yeah, we can see.
Perfect. That making sure that the spaces are created by those that have got power and the kind of systems that allow for some of the relationships to be messy, to be innovative, to try things and fail, but to create safety around that, to allow relationships to happen, because they are messy. Human relationships are inherently messy, but the obligation needs to be on those in power to create the spaces for those to happen, rather than requiring individuals to feel that they're putting themselves and others at risk by taking chances or doing things and not following policies. And so what incorporation really allows us to do in using human rights is to challenge that and say, actually, this policy doesn't allow me to do this. I haven't got enough time to spend on this relationship. I haven't got the support and training to do some thinking about how, I haven't got enough time to plan this. I haven't got enough time to develop this. And therefore you're failing in your obligation to this child or young person, but it applies to adults too. So I think those tools are really challenging those in power to make sure they create the spaces and the support and training and everything else that allows relationships to really thrive. But that shouldn't be held as it is at the moment by the individual, because the rights obligation is actually on the decision makers, not on the individual. And so the more that we can really push back and challenge that, so that you're not saying, I've done this because it was in the best interest, and we knew that this was going to be really effective, and having to justify it, but rather saying, no, you need to give me the space to do this within all of the kind of agreed parameters, but you need to do that to allow me to then explore this in the best way.
So can I, because there's been a really interesting question coming from Carly, and George, I am absolutely aware you've got your hand up and you have had for a while, so I'll come to you after. Is that okay? Because Carly's actually specified something quite linked to what you just said, Bruce. Carly, are you happy to speak about that? I can read it in the chat and I think it links in really well.
No, I'm happy to speak about that. Hi everyone, it's great to be here. I hope you can hear me all right. So I work in the public mental health team at Public Health Scotland, and we've been doing a pretty huge piece of work with colleagues from a few different places, but it basically it's all about relationships, and it's embedding relational practice in education settings. So mainly with Education Scotland, Bernardo's, more recently Children's Parliament as well. And I guess some of my reflections of that work has been, people don't even know that what they're doing is relational practice. And by people, I mean education staff who are doing the most incredible stuff, but maybe aren't counting it, completely dismissing it, or completely writing it off, really minimising fantastic relational practice because it doesn't maybe have a scientific base or an academic paper. And I guess what we found is that we created a film that completely demystifies what even is a relationship. What does it look like? What do you need to say and what do you need to do to be relational in your practice? And what are the impacts of that? And the feedback we've had from that has been really quite incredible, to the point that for schools going back in August for the most recent academic term, Education Scotland came to us and said, can we produce an infographic that's a bit like a script of what you say in a good quality relationship? And education staff are saying, I didn't know that's what I was doing. And I think I just worry sometimes that we're making it too much of a thing, when in actual fact people are doing such great things, or I'm worried that actually maybe I'm not qualified enough, or maybe I'm not professional enough. And actually what we find some of the conversations is that people are doing such fantastic stuff. And I guess I just worry that when we say things like relational practice, do people even know what that means, or what it looks like, or what it feels like? And actually it has been so powerful to say to some of the education staff, the teachers or the school support staff, the janitors, the dinner ladies, to say, when you smile and say it's lovely to see you, that's like a great example of relational practice. And the children and young people who worked with us on that project have said, I love it when they notice that I'm wearing a new hairband, or the teenagers say, I love when they look up from their laptop and say, it's so nice to see you today, and it's great to have you in my class. And I think it was just so powerful for us to hear that they didn't even see that as relational practice. They were like, oh yeah, that's just what I do, but I need to read up in relational practice. So I guess I just wanted to share that, and I think it just, as you were speaking, it just made me really think about some of that feedback and some of my own reflections.
Can I jump in there, Elly?
Yes. Yeah.
Carly, I'm so glad you shared that, because I think that's a really important thing, is to recognise that so much of this is something that people already do instinctively, and there's so much that we can build on, and those points around what a community looks like, and the importance of school communities, and being much more than just the teachers, but also the facility staff and the catering staff, and for many children some of those are really important relationships, and again it doesn't have to be in kind of particular kind of verbal ways, but even kind of proximity and understanding and just noticing, and all of that is hugely powerful. And it's one of the things that I've had a lot of conversations with catering staff, dinner ladies, often usually self-defined as that, but about the really important human rights work that they're doing, and then the kind of purpose of that, and again the real opportunity that they have to be such an important part of children and young people's lives. And many of the conversations that I've had with children about their experience over the last couple of years, that's what they're talking about, is the kind of relationship of kind of being in schools, and the time that you need to build that up. And so we have an opportunity within school communities where often it's kind of over years that those relationships kind of build up, and they may change depending on different job roles, but just how important those are, and just how difficult it's been to have the disruption of that, the times when children weren't in school buildings, but also just that some of the children going through transition and things, and just how much that's affecting children and young people. And so it's a hugely important message that you're giving, and I think the work that you're doing to all of those, particularly within school communities, but everywhere else, just about how much value we need to place on that. And I think one of the things I'm concerned about, when you look at the way the Convention on the Rights of the Child talks about the purpose of education, or talks about health and mental health, it does it in a really holistic way, whereas the things that we measure in Scotland and in other places in terms of what we see as valuable to society misses a big chunk of that. It's not just about passing exams and very academic achievement or sporting achievement or cultural achievement. It's actually so much of it's about those relationships. And when we assess the value of professionals, and when we assess the progress and development of children and young people, we don't do very well at having the kind of the metrics that we would use, the way in which we measure and value that. And I think that really needs to change, because it leads to a position where you've got some of the most amazing good practice that we want to share isn't being properly valued, and then we all lose out. And I think that all the conversations that I've been having with children and young people, it's all been about relationships. I was at a judo club a couple of nights ago. I'm still quite sore, actually. And that was one of the things that a lot of the young people I was speaking, and children I was speaking to there, was talking about, was the value of those relationships and that community. And when kind of pressed for examples, it wasn't about them becoming better judo practitioners. It was about the relationships And I think that was interesting, that we do see it probably more sometimes in kind of clubs and community-based things where they do talk about that a lot more, whereas in educational settings, we don't talk about it enough, I think.
And I think that's one of the examples I used, was that my daughter started school during the pandemic. So like went into P1, and going to her school was the first building that she'd been in apart from her house. And the thing that really helped her was on a Friday, she would get a sticker that said, well, I did great, I ate all my lunch, and she would put it on her pyjamas and wear it the whole weekend and take it back in on Monday when it lost its stick. And I've fed that back in some of the training that I've been doing and saying, you know, how do we share the power of the sticker and, you know, that lovely lunch lady, building up that relationship to make it much easier to go back in the Monday. So that's our popping in. So I guess you're right, but that's not measured. Whereas my son, after having COVID, returned to school to meet his new teacher, and the first day was a full day of standardised assessments. That felt pretty rubbish. But I won't go on. But I'm just, it's lovely to hear that you have those feedback from other places too, and I'm sure lots of people have lots of different examples of that.
Thank you, Carly. I'm just going to go to George, if that's okay, and then I want to come back to Chris, because there's another really good question in the chat which links to what you've just been saying. But if I can just go to George, who's been patiently waiting as well. Thank you, Carly.
George, just before you start, I'm just going to try and turn my light back on. I am listening to, I can still hear you, but I'll disappear from screen for a second as I try and get the lights back on.
Right, go ahead.
Carry on, George.
Well, thank you, everybody. This is an absolutely wonderful conversation, and it's not about this is not about me, but just a background. I've always been an advocate and mentor to particularly young wheelchair users, and for the last 5 years have set up 2 operational care providers, and so consider myself I'm proud to be a social care professional. And I guess my reflection is all the things that we're talking about and all the examples we're talking about are indeed what I'd like to define and what I personally would define as social care. And I look at my sector, and I do believe there's too much of a narrow transactional value on the tasks and the nature of the tasks that are delivered and defined as social care. When indeed the people that I receive the most richness and the most information from about the people that I support and love supporting is indeed the parents, their teachers, their communities, and therefore, whilst I do not wish for this to sound particularly revolutionary, I do believe we need to work towards a different definition of what social care is, and from that, what we believe we are funding when we fund social care, and Bruce and people on this call might disagree with me when I say that, but the question for Bruce that I would have is, if I am indeed right, and I might not be, what is the vision for social care that we're aiming for, and what do you think perhaps the parallels for people that are already embedded in my sector? What is it that we need to learn and embed in our practice, if indeed we change the definition of what social care means?
I think that's a great point, George. And I think that at the heart of it is that this has to be led by people who are experiencing it. It has to be experience led. And I think that that's one of the things that we don't do enough of, is create the systems, create the spaces to allow people to express themselves in terms of what they want. And the point that you made around how you get information to allow you to make decisions, and particularly in terms of what are the closest relationships to people, who knows that who being able to express yourself in a way that best suits you, and then the people that know you the best being able to, the people that you trust and want to help with that as well, is really important. And I think that at the heart of any human rights-based approach needs to be putting the voices of people with experience right at the heart of it. And so I think in terms of the revolution in social care that you're talking about, I think that absolutely needs to be led by those that are experiencing it. And I think this is one of the interesting things in human rights terms, in that we've got the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which I talk about a lot and love, but it is 30 years old. And then we had the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the Disabled People's Treaty, which came much later, and it went so much further in saying that you need to do a lot more to actually break away from this idea that it's about receiving services, rather than saying that it's not about receiving services, it's about having a right to human dignity. It's about having a right to have all the things that allow you to engage with society in a meaningful way that works for you. And the obligation on the state is to work with you to do that. And I think that that's where the change needs to come. We still haven't gone far enough around ensuring that the system allows for that expression and allows for that design. And I think that some of the things that we're starting to discuss then come up against the kind of financial arguments, and where we're seeing really, really concerning cuts in terms of social care, in terms of social security, which really run counter to what's required in human rights terms, and also really undermines the ability to take a rights-based approach, which puts the voice of the person experiencing this at the heart of decision making. Mm. I don't know whether that answers your question or not, George. I think you already had the answer.
I was just going to dive in there because it just reminded me of Lord Munby, who said years ago, well, not that long ago, but you know, the state is a servant, not a master. And it's that talking in a relational terms about, you know, power and control dynamics, and that we need to let go of that. Because if we're going to build the trust, which you've talked a lot about, and Carly was talking about, you know, this not making it a thing, so not making it another course we have to go on, or another, you know, like, this is about being human, and it's about remembering how we all like to be treated and the power in that, because actually relationships are the glue. They really are the glue. It's like the cement in the wall, isn't it, for everybody? And just thinking, George, you probably know as well, like the social care future work that Neil Crowther's doing in the UK, and that Rob Mitchell talks about, and also Bryony Shannon writes beautifully about rewriting social care. That kind of flips the whole thing on its head and looks at it relationally, talks about homes, not placements, and the life you want to lead, and the right, you know, the right that you have to lead it in the way anybody chooses, rather than having it dictated for you. Brings it back to that relational message, doesn't it? I'm just
sorry, Elly.
I'm just conscious I've got to go to Chris and Sinead, I think, after that. Yeah, sorry, George.
10 seconds. The important article in the Convention of the Rights of People with Disabilities, if I may say so, is indeed Article 19, which is the right to live independently. And the right to live independently means freedom of choice and freedom of expression, as well as kind of the boundary of the place in which you live and who you live with. And indeed, all of those statements have a relational emphasis, and you know, social care futures have got that right.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, it's fantastic work, and I think it's out there. It needs to go out there more, because I read it a lot because I love the relational message of it, and it's brave, and it's proud, and it's saying let's do it differently, and it's linking to what Bruce just said around, you know, it's actually bringing it back to everybody with the lived experience having, you know, being the forefront of the conversation and met as an equal, and we are delivering our service to this client, not they should be grateful to receive whatever we hand out. I'm going to go to Chris, if that's okay, because I'm just conscious we've got a couple of questions, if that's all right with you, Chris.
Yeah, hi, thanks. I'll try to be concise. I'm Chris Mayes, is from an organisation called Fathers Network Scotland. I spent a number of years working for the education service in Fife, and in Fife we were looking to improve outcomes for children in early years that were supported through early years services. One of the big challenges that we found across early years services was that engaging the other parent that wasn't the mother, it was a real challenge for services. So whether we're talking about dads, stepdads, grandparents or whatever. So for the past few years with Fathers Network Scotland, we've been doing quite a lot of work with services to try to help services be more inclusive of, I guess, what you might call the hidden parent or the invisible parent. But during COVID, we ran a few surveys with parents and with fathers and partners in particular about their COVID experience. And what's come through loud and clear is that it's no surprise that all parents that are supporting a child have spent far more time involved in their learning, their education, than just about any other time that they have had prior to COVID. But one of the interesting things from our surveys that we've done with fathers and partners is highlighted that although homeschooling was a real challenge, and no one really wants to go back to where we were with lockdown and homeschooling, the message has come through loud and clear that fathers don't want to go back to how they used to parent. In other words, they want to be more engaged with their child's learning. And it's not just about fathers and dads, it's about anybody that's in that family that every child comes with. So whoever they happen to be. I know that in my own family, my own parents, my children's grandparents were really involved in stuff that they hadn't been involved in before. So I suppose people made the change because it was forced upon them. People were more engaged that hadn't been engaged previously with things like the child's learning. In Scotland, we really are trying to take that kind of child-centred, whole family around the child sort of focus. Is this a real, has COVID given us a golden opportunity, a sort of window of opportunity that might not stay open for too much longer? As things do go back to normal, people will slip back into old habits and probably already are. But I think the fact that our survey and other bits of evidence have told us that parents who weren't engaged and who are engaged now want to continue that engagement, it's a real opportunity. There's an opportunity for some of our services that maybe aren't particularly traditionally as good at engaging some parents and carers as maybe they have been engaging mums, for example. And that's no detriment on engaging with mums. And I know there's a lot of background and complexity around that issue. But I just wonder what to know your view on that, to take us towards that place in Scotland where, as services, we really are trying to determine who that family is and engage with them, as opposed to deciding systematically or any other way.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I think that's a really powerful point, and there's a lot in it in terms of the changes that we need to make and the barriers that we put in place in relation to that. One of the big things that children and young people have told us consistently as one of the things that they liked most about COVID, the kind of silver lining perhaps, was additional time for many children with their families, with parents not going out to work. And again, particularly, there was a much stronger element of saying time with fathers, because we still live in a society where mums and women tend to take on so much more of that role in the house, and having fathers around a lot more is something that a lot of children have picked up and as a real positive. And if we go back to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, it talks about family, it talks about the role of both parents, but also talks about a kind of a broader conception of what family is. And I think that we need to make some significant changes in society if we want to really pick up on the thing that children told us was so valuable, which was about time with their parents, with their families, with grandparents and others, with people that they didn't see because those people were working or otherwise doing other things outside the house. And so I think there is a real opportunity. I think the window is closing very quickly though, Chris. I think we are lapsing very quickly back into old habits. I think things like the financial support that was put in through things like furlough, we should be measuring the other non-economic value of that furlough scheme. And so if you talk to children and young people who had furloughed parents, particularly those who had stable jobs to go back to and weren't suffering the stresses of work insecurity, this was actually fantastic for so many families that they were actually had state support to spend time working on their relationships. And I'm not undermining any of the stresses and then the challenges of COVID, but many children talk about that as a really positive thing if they had that financial stability to focus on those relationships. And I think that as we move through and out of COVID, I think there's some real questions to ask around the relationship between work and how we value how people spend their time. And I think there is a really strong gender dimension in that, because I think that what we've seen consistently is the disproportionate role that women take in terms of childcare and maintaining houses, and the disproportionate societal pressure that we put on men to be out of the house and seeing that as valuable. And I think that the UN and UN Women have talked about women's rights being put back significantly because of the impact of the pandemic. And I think it's also we need to reflect on how we can change the way in which men engage with their role as fathers. And again, a very quick personal reflection. I took a year off work when my daughter was between 1 and 2, and I had to really fight with the organization I was working for, which was a human rights organization, to take that time off. I had to really argue and take it to a really senior level to try and get time off, because it just wasn't seen as something that men should be doing, and because of the role I had in the organization. And I find that really worrying that was only 6 years ago, that we've still got that really embedded in terms of some of those gender roles, which I think are really damaging. And so I think we do have a window. I think we need to look at the state's obligation to put in place support to allow for that time to take place. And we also need to really challenge some of the kind of societal expectations that we put on everyone to be working, and the kind of value of paid work as opposed to the really important value of things within the home and relationships. And I think I worry that window is closing very quickly, and that we're going back to the way things were. And I think that if you ask children and young people, which I get to do every day, it's amazing how much value they placed on that extra time, particularly if it was a safe and supportive environment, and there wasn't money worries and things, on that extra time that they had with their parents. And I think we need to be able to make sure that that's properly valued by us as a society.
I think I'm just going to pick up there on one thing that Chris also wrote, which was just around the whole family approaches, which I think is something I'm really quite passionate about, because as he says, obviously, when I was growing up, we had a whole street that was a family. Like, I could go to any one of my neighbours and spend time with them if my parents were either at work or whatever. And it was this sense of an extension of your family, as in the relationships you had were, I had 8 doors I could knock on and go into any of those houses. I know I would be fed, looked after until somebody came to get me. There was, just because it was like that open door relational. And I think in COVID, although it's not maybe reflective of that, certainly where I live now, but it's been a reliance on outside of like your standard sort of family concept, and it's gone back to more of the community networking, hasn't it? And more of the, you know, the grandparents, if they have grandparents, or the extended family, or the very close friends that they refer to as aunt, uncle, or whatever. And we've brought that back in, and it's given children, I think, educationally a wider perspective, but also made them aware of the value of relationships, because these relationships have maybe been the ones they've had in lieu of their friends being able to be seen or going into their classrooms. Or so it in a way is kind of developed out like that whole family approach a bit more, as in the importance of it, hasn't it? I suppose alongside, you know, the right to have a life where you can have relationships and families, etc. The concept of like that whole family approach, again, it's like a positive ripple effect, buoying up against all the negativity that was going on. We had these pockets of brilliance, to coin a phrase from Sarah Ryan, which has got nothing to do with this, but actually fits really well. But I'm just going to mention it because she said it. So I don't know if I got that right, Chris, but I was kind of picking up from, it was like it's become a bigger network, and how do we make sure we use that going forward rather than lose it? and what can we do to hook into it, because I've seen it all over, and friends have talked about things they just didn't do before COVID. When everything stopped, it was like the world, the day the internet went off, in a way. It's kind of had that kind of effect. We had to find other ways of being and doing and connecting and relating, and there's so much that's actually a positive going forward, because we've learned a lot. I don't know if that is what you were saying, Chris. I'm just I'm going to stop there unless anyone wants to add to that, because I think I've got Sinead, who's being really patient, sitting in the wings while I rabbit on. So I don't know if it made sense, but I just thought it was really poignant how you'd written it, Chris, because it just, I was like, oh yeah.
Very much, and thanks for both your answers. Really, really useful. And I think, I suppose, just from my perspective, in terms of the work that I do, it's how, as you said, Bruce, how does the state, how does local authority, how does the public sector, how do our services that work with children and families, how do we respond to what children have told us during COVID? How do we respond to how families have acted and behaved in a positive way and what they've told us? We can't just let it lie, you know. So yeah, that's really helpful. Thanks very much.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Sinead. Is that okay? If you're still with us, and thank you for being so patient.
Hi. Hello. I hope you can hear me okay.
Yes.
Thank you all. It's a really interesting discussion. I'm a head teacher of a secondary school in Glasgow, and was really interested, Bruce, in what you were saying around those kind of metrics of how we measure things like relationships and well-being and all those sorts of things. And I'm quite sure you're really aware of a lot of debate around that, because certainly I would say pretty much every secondary head teacher particularly, we just constantly feel that all we are measured on is exam results. And that is certainly the feeling that we have. And so all the work we do around relationships, and in our school in particular, it's been a huge thing over the last few years, looking at how we shift from this kind of real top-down hierarchy in the school to shifting to building relationships with young people, and really taking on board a lot of the UNCRC stuff around their rights. And it's, how do you measure that? And I think people are putting some interesting things here in the chat around how we might do that and those kind of survey-based approaches. But it's just, I think there's a really interesting thing to be done around how we actually create a national picture and a metric that can measure those things, because no matter how much we talk about it, it's still not something that is measured in secondary schools at all. So just interested in any thoughts anyone had around that.
Yeah, thanks, Sinead. And I think the work that you're doing is absolutely essential. And I always come back to the way in which the purpose of education is defined within Article 29 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and it talks about developing children to their fullest potential, and that includes emotionally. It's not just about academic or sporting or cultural achievement. It's about development to the fullest potential. That's the test. And then, as you say, I think particularly in secondaries, because of the focus on a very narrow definition of what attainment looks like. And I think it's been worse during COVID because of all of the pressures. And I think that you and other leaders within education, and every teacher and everyone in the school community, are absolute heroes for what you've been doing over the last couple of years, because and before that, but I think particularly the last couple of years, because of all of the work that you've done to support children and young people. And children and young people tell me this every single day, just how much they value teachers and schools and school leadership and school communities as being not just a place of education in the narrow sense, but a place where they access so many of the other rights, in terms of a safe place for so many children, a place where you socialize, a place where your mental and physical health's really developed. And coming back to that idea that education is much, much broader, but then you're under very, very difficult and often very bureaucratic kind of measurements which don't speak to that, and that really worries me. And I've got the best job in the world. I love it. I get to speak to children, young people all day, and go to lots of interesting places and things. But you really notice it if you go to an early years centre or a nursery, and the way in which they undertake their really good relationship-based practice, and again with children who are often non-verbal, and you see all of that, and you see the way that children respond to that, and then the more bureaucracy we add in, the more structure we put around it, the more we lose that. And I think there's really something to learn from some of the practice that's happening in early years, and how we measure and reward that. Because I think by the time that we get up to secondary, the restrictions that are put on you, even though you're doing great relationship-based practice, but you're not being rewarded for that. And also, if you talk to children and young people, which I know everyone on the school does, but I know you do, Sinead, obviously every day. But that's the thing that they really value. Of course, they want to do well. Of course, they want their education to take them the places they want to go in life. But the stuff that they really value is the teachers that know them and understand them, that are helping them develop. It is the spaces to make friendships, and the kind of understanding that that's not always a smooth path, and that emotions change, and we're going through lots of different stuff as we develop as young people, and school being a place that can really help support that. And I think that we need to really change the way in which we reward the schools and the practitioners that are putting in place those frameworks that actually speak to that broader promise in terms of education, which is to develop children to their fullest potential. And we're not doing that if we're only focused on a very narrow definition of what academic achievement is, or cultural or sporting achievement. It's the wrong measurement. And I think we really have an opportunity to kind of push back on that. I think it's been a very difficult couple of years, but as we move forward in terms of what children value, what we value as a society, and interestingly, I know I'm rambling on, Elly, I'll stop. But interestingly, some of the conversations I've had with European colleagues in Germany and other places, talking about what business wants as well, is that, and in terms of saying, if we're trying to prepare children if it's about getting jobs, talk to business about this, because they'll tell you what they want is people that are good problem solvers, that can work in a team, that can have that kind of emotional regulation. It's about relationships is the main thing that you want in terms of successful business. The other stuff they can teach. Of course, we need to teach children all the skills that they need, but the skills that we need in society and business are actually the relationship-based skills. And that's often where things go wrong, is that if we're not teaching those things, then it doesn't matter how good you are at passing exams, you're not going to live up to that potential, because it's those other skills that we really need to focus on supporting throughout childhood. Some of the other stuff you can learn as an adult, but that stuff's really important to embed. And I think we do some great stuff in kind of early years, and then we take away the ability of really skilled professionals to do it later on in education. Sorry, that was a bit of a rant.
No, I'm going to jump in there because I've got, thank you so much, Sinead, but I'm going to have to we're going to sort of try and bring this to a semi-close, although this last question might divert off. But just thinking about that, because I think years ago that was referred to as soft skills, or like I would say they're human skills. I don't like the word soft skills. So those are the human skills that you're saying are really essential for everybody to thrive in life, not just survive, actually thrive. You need to how to interact with your, whoever you're in contact with, also not just for the positives in life, but also, when children are in difficulties and negative situations, they've got to be able to have the confidence and the skills to be able to say, I said no, stop, this is my right, etc. And that leads me on to thinking, sitting in England, I'm very close to the border, but I am in a different country, and Scotland seems much further ahead in terms of the language using. And I interact and follow the work of Melissa Rutherford and the Trauma Lawyer Group quite a lot, because they are really pushing it through the justice system, and they openly talk in a language that I still think for England we're a bit like, what are you doing? And it's not what are you doing, it's just the comfort level's not there. Scotland's got the bit between their teeth. We're talking about trauma on many different levels. The pandemic was massive trauma for everybody. Recovering from that, it takes those human skills. It takes putting the relationships first. It takes more compassion, kindness, and a bigger space, and actually holding each other up instead of shutting each other down, which we're great at doing on social media. You know, we can all be really mean to each other. It's not necessary, is it? It's just not what we're here to do. And for kids watching us, it's kind of like, I often think about the adult behavior first. What are we demonstrating to the future generations if we don't embrace and say, this is the better way to be? This actually gives you skills in life you are going to need to rely on time and again, in good and bad times, to be able to get through and survive. And not survive, thrive, because survival isn't good enough for these kids. We want them to really thrive and have that place in society, don't we? So there's my ramble, because I'm passionate about trauma, and I think Scotland's so much further ahead in many different ways, because you stand very strongly for children's rights, which I think is really powerful, and you're much further ahead. You know, we're going backwards, and I probably shouldn't say that, but I'm going to. And then trauma is really up there, and the lawyers are pushing it through, and there's lots of kind of underpinning this with the law, and there's lots of the black and white stuff alongside the human need for it. So I don't think it was really a question. It was kind of like, that's my take on where Scotland is and where you're going with this. And what would you say, how do you get the other nation? And I think the other nations other than England are doing better than we are as well. So maybe, like, what would you say to England and the other nations? How could we join it up more, like the 4 nations? You know, how do we become more integrated in our approaches, particularly when we're looking at, I know we all have very different policies and laws and all that, but we're all human beings. We have the same needs.
Yeah, I would. I'm struggling here, so I don't want to end on a negative, but I do think we need to be cautious.
No, lift it up.
I think we need to be cautious about Scottish exceptionalism, and I think you are right that sometimes we use the language in Scotland that sounds quite positive, but I'm not sure we're very good at converting that into outcomes. And I think you're absolutely right. Melissa Rutherford, Ian Smith, some of the trauma-informed lawyers are really championing change within the criminal justice system. But again, the messages we're sending to children and young people with the way in which we have very low ages of criminal responsibility. It's still only 12 in Scotland, 10 in England. Yeah. But that message about using the criminal law to address behaviour by children really undermines some of the fact that we haven't made the progress on physical punishment. Scotland's only just prohibited physical punishment. England has not yet done that. But Scotland's maybe slightly ahead, but I don't think Scotland's where the rest of the UK should be looking. I think that actually we need to look further afield, because I think the whole UK can really learn from some of the stuff happening in lots of other parts of the world. And I think sometimes that if we're only aiming as high as the best UK nation, then that's the wrong place to be looking. I think we have to be looking much further afield to be saying we want to be leading on this stuff. And actually within the criminal justice setting, we're very much worst in the world. And so we need to be much, much more radical. And I think it's amazing that we've got within the UK champions like you, Elly, and some of the incredible kind of revolutionary practice that we're pitching here. But I think it is really important that we celebrate and champion the amazing human rights defenders like you and everyone on this call. And again, Claire, thanks so much for bringing all of this together and all of your work. But we need to acknowledge that this is a big change that we need, and we should celebrate every success. But there's a real long way to go to make this kind of rhetoric and discussion to change the language, and then there's another big step to actually making that reality, and that's going to require all of us to support each other and to make sure that children and young people and other voices are right at the heart of that, and real change from decision makers. And I worry that it can't just be talk. And again, when you speak to children and young people, that's the big thing that they talk about, but it's got to be about action. It's got to be about change. Words aren't enough. Words are hugely, hugely powerful, and we have to keep focusing on the positive. And I agree with you, Elly, that sometimes, particularly on social media, that's not happening at the moment. But if we put children and young people and their rights and their voices and experiences at the heart of this, and then we build a culture of being human rights defenders around this, I think it puts us in a really good place to deliver the change that we need. But we should never, ever be complacent about the fact that we need to change this into changing the experience of children and young people in the criminal justice system, disabled children and young people, care experience, children and young people, young carers, the impacts of poverty and mental health on young people. Is we really need to change society, and it's been great to spend the time with all of you, and thanks Elly, and thanks Claire, and thanks everyone, because this gives me a lot of energy to keep going, but we really do need to keep supporting each other and demand that change.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Bruce. I'm just going to acknowledge Alison's comment as well, because I know she hasn't had a chance to speak, but that's fantastic to hear that you focus on the relationships, which is what you're saying, Bruce. And I think just to close, would there be one, and there probably isn't one piece of advice, or what would you say if people are sitting here going, like, I really want to do something, you know, and it maybe they sit within the social care space, they might sit within the healthcare space, there might just be a parent at home, there might be somebody who just thinks, I just want to do something. It's big, it's wide, it's long, it's huge. So what would you say is like a good way to start? And if we're looking outside of the UK, where are we looking? Like, because I know there are lots of relationally positive spaces, and there's some really good practice, and but it's worldwide, isn't it? I mean, is there a way of not looking at it and going, it's just too big? How would people maybe find where they fit so that they can be that person that facilitates that change? Because it is all the small changes and linking together, isn't it, that eventually creates that wave?
I mean, it's trite to say, but it is start where you are, do what you can. I mean, it is about everything, every conversation that you have, every time that you kind of build on your own knowledge is really important. Link in with me and my office. I know, again, link in with you, Elly, link in with you, Claire. Building these connections and having these conversations is really important. And then within kind of professional settings, again, I'm really keen to work with anyone who wants to kind of take a rights-based approach to challenging those that are in power. And because I think the experience is really important. I can sit as Children's Commissioner and try and make people take a rights-based approach and ensure that kind of amplify the voices of children and young people. But I'm not a practitioner. And so your voices as practitioners, your voices as people, your voices as parents, as all of those relationships are really important. And so the more that we can create structures within decision making that take this rights-based approach and put participation and experience into the heart of decision making, the better. So I think that it's constantly challenging that as I think the key. And please do get in touch in terms of anything we can do to support that. And again, can reach out to international colleagues. And there's so many inspiring people internationally, and I think that technology is allowing us to do that a lot more. But the big message, again, one of the big priorities for me over the last few years in this role has been building on the ability of child human rights defenders, children who want to make a difference and who are asking exactly that question, what can I do? And the big message is that find the things that you're passionate about, and then it's my job to make sure that you get the support to actually take that forward, but never undervalue the actions that you're taking, because everything that you do to make the world a better place and to change things makes a big difference. And some of the things that I've seen that have been most transformative have really started as kind of small ideas in small places in primary schools, secondary schools. And some of my biggest heroes as human rights defenders are the young people that I work with that are incredibly inspiring, who, if you ask them, would say that they don't know very much about it, or that they haven't made a difference, but they do in a way that I can't. And I think that that's really important. So every single one of you has the power to make that change, and it's the job of people like me and others to support you in that. And so make the connections and keep on fighting, I think, is the main thing.
Thank you so much, Bruce. I think I'm going to draw it to a close there, because I'm conscious we ran over a little bit, but we started a little bit late, so I got a grace period from Claire. So thank you. And I think Claire's going to come back in and just finish everything off. But thank you so much for joining us. It's so much appreciated. People are saying thank you in the chat, and thank you very much to them for joining us as well. It's been a very quick hour, but there will be a further opportunity to talk to you more at the event, which I'm sure Claire's going to briefly talk about now. But it's really great to see you again. Thank you so much.
Thank you both so much. Honestly, that I really feel that was a very positive discussion, and sharing practice online like this is imperative. So hopefully these conversations will be taken forward into the event, and we can discuss it in far more detail, because we have a whole host of fantastic speakers lined up for that. I just really want to say thank you to everybody for coming, and a big thank you to Bruce and Elly for giving up your time. I really appreciate it, and I know you'll have taken away quite a lot from this evening as well. And if you wouldn't mind, there's a very quick short survey just at the end. It's really just to make sure that we're putting on the right things that help, and the right times as well. I know it doesn't suit everybody, but that would be great. And hope to see you all again. Thank you very much for coming.
Thanks, Claire. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, Claire. Thanks, everyone. Cheers. Thanks, Elly.
Take care.